Some disappearances arrive without warning. A routine day ends without explanation. A teenager leaves home, and the expected return never happens. In small communities, time usually works in patterns: school schedules, family habits, familiar routes. When one of those patterns breaks, it stands out immediately. Questions start quietly and then multiply. Where did she go? Who saw her last? Why is there no sign of trouble? In Montana, in the mid-1990s, a case began this way. No alarms, no witnesses rushing forward, just a growing absence that refused to explain itself. What followed would stretch across decades, shaped by evidence preserved, questions left unanswered, and a truth that remained hidden long after the search stopped. If you value careful reporting over noise and facts over shortcuts, consider subscribing before we continue. Danielle Houchins was 15 years old in April 1996. She lived in Belgrade, Montana, a community where daily life followed predictable rhythms. She attended school, spent time with friends, and remained close to her family. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was planning to leave or place herself in danger. When she went out that day, it appeared ordinary. As hours passed without contact, concern set in. By that evening, her family reported her missing. Law enforcement responded and began standard missing person procedures. Officers gathered basic information, confirmed last known movements, and contacted friends and acquaintances. Early searches focused on locations she might have reached on foot or by short travel. The effort intensified quickly. Community members assisted in looking through nearby areas. Routes she may have taken were checked. There was no immediate sign of where she had gone or what had happened. The lack of information complicated the response. There was no abandoned vehicle, no items left behind, no witness who could point in a clear direction. Several days later, the search ended in the worst possible way. Danielle's body was discovered in a remote area outside town. The finding shifted the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide inquiry. The reality that she had been killed settled heavily over her family and the community. Law enforcement secured the scene and began evidence collection. Investigators documented the location, preserved physical material, and followed forensic procedures available at the time. Biological evidence was recovered and properly stored. In the mid-1990s, DNA analysis existed, but lacked the speed and reach it would later achieve. Samples could be processed, but comparison databases were limited, and matches were far from guaranteed. Detectives worked to reconstruct Danielle's final movements. They reviewed where she had been seen, who she had interacted with, and what could be confirmed rather than assumed. Interviews were conducted with people in her circle and those who may have crossed her path. Each statement was logged and evaluated. Despite sustained effort, the investigation did not immediately identify a suspect. No arrest followed. The evidence collected did not point clearly to a specific individual. The case moved forward, but without momentum. The impact on Belgrade was immediate and lasting. A teenager had been killed, and no explanation followed. Fear and grief coexisted with uncertainty. Parents worried. Routines felt altered. The absence of answers kept the loss present rather than processed. As weeks turned into months, the investigation continued, but progress slowed. Leads were followed and exhausted. Information came in and was checked. None of it produced the clarity needed to move the case toward charges. The preserved evidence remained central, even as technology limited what could be done with it. The case did not close. It remained open, unresolved, and active only in record. Danielle Houchins was not forgotten, but the path forward was unclear. The investigation reached a boundary defined not by effort, but what could be proven. That boundary would hold for years. The early decisions made in those first days and weeks would shape everything that followed. Evidence would wait, questions would remain, and a community would carry the weight of a case that refused to resolve long after the initial search ended. Once Danielle Houchins' death was confirmed, the focus shifted fully to investigation. Law enforcement secured the area where her body was found and began a careful process of documentation. Every detail that could be recorded was noted. The location, the condition of the scene, and the surrounding environment were examined methodically. This work was done with the understanding that early evidence often determines whether a case moves forward or stalls. Forensic procedures followed the standards available in the mid-1990s. Investigators collected biological material and other physical evidence that could later assist in identifying a suspect. Each item was cataloged and preserved. At the time, DNA testing was possible, but its reach was limited. Databases were small, processing was slow. Matches depended heavily on whether a suspect was already known or had previously provided a sample. Detectives began reconstructing Danielle's final movements. They worked backward from confirmed sightings and known locations. Friends, classmates, and people within her daily routine were interviewed. Investigators sought to establish where she had gone, who she may have encountered, and whether anything unusual had occurred in the hours before her disappearance. These interviews were detailed and repetitive by necessity. Timelines were compared, statements were checked for consistency. Small discrepancies were noted, not as accusations, but as points requiring clarification. In cases involving young victims, investigators must distinguish between rumor, assumption, and verifiable fact. That distinction guided the early work. Despite these efforts, no immediate suspect emerged. The information gathered did not point clearly to a specific individual. Leads were followed and assessed. Some were eliminated quickly, others required additional review. None produced the evidence needed to support an arrest. The lack of a clear suspect placed increased importance on physical evidence. Investigators relied on what had been preserved at the scene. Laboratory analysis was conducted within the limits of the time. Results did not identify a perpetrator. Without a match or confession, the case remained open but unresolved. As days passed, the investigation expanded geographically. Officers examined whether Danielle could have encountered someone outside her usual circles. Tips from the public were logged and evaluated. Each tip required verification, even when information was vague or second-hand. This process was time-consuming and often produced little return, but it remained essential. The community continued to feel the impact. Fear and uncertainty influenced daily life. Parents became more cautious. Familiar spaces felt altered. The absence of answers kept the case present in conversations and concern. Law enforcement faced a difficult balance. They needed to act decisively while avoiding assumptions that could compromise the investigation. Without strong evidence, applying pressure in the wrong direction risked overlooking the truth. This restraint is often misunderstood as inaction, but it reflects the legal and ethical limits investigators must respect. As weeks turned into months, the flow of new information slowed. Leads were revisited and exhausted. Evidence was reviewed again. Nothing changed the status of the case. The investigation did not end, but it reached a point where further progress required something new. That something did not appear. With no arrest and no additional evidence, the case transitioned into a different state. Active investigation gave way to preservation. Files were organized. Evidence was secured. The work shifted from pursuit to maintenance. This stage is common in unsolved homicide cases. It does not mean the case is forgotten. It means it is held in readiness. Investigators rely on the possibility that future developments, technology, or information may reopen paths that were once closed. For Danielle Houchins, that readiness mattered. The evidence collected during this period remained intact. Decisions about preservation would later prove critical. At the time, however, those outcomes were unknown. What remained was a case defined by effort without resolution. The investigation had been thorough within its limits. The absence of answers was not the result of neglect, but of constraint. The system had reached the edge of what it could do with the tools and information available. As the early investigation concluded, Danielle's case entered a long stretch of uncertainty. The groundwork had been laid, evidence had been saved, questions remained unanswered, and time, rather than clarity, became the defining element that followed. As the investigation continued, attention turned toward possibilities rather than certainties. Detectives reviewed every piece of information gathered so far, searching for connections that could explain how Danielle Houchins crossed paths with someone capable of harming her. The work became slower and more deliberate, shaped by elimination rather than discovery. Investigators examined Danielle's daily routines in detail. School schedules, familiar walking paths, and regular stops were mapped and reconsidered. They looked at where she spent time, how she moved through town, and who might have known her habits. Nothing immediately suggested she had strayed far from what was normal for her. Friends and classmates were interviewed again. Their accounts were compared carefully, not because of suspicion, but to confirm timelines and identify gaps. In cases involving young victims, accuracy matters. Even small timing errors can misdirect an investigation. Officers worked to ensure that what was recorded reflected what could be confirmed, not what was assumed. Tips continued to arrive from the public. Some were based on rumor, others came from genuine concern. Each was documented and assessed. Law enforcement followed up where possible, checking locations and verifying names. Most tips led nowhere. A few raised questions that required additional review. None produced evidence strong enough to change the direction of the case. Attention expanded beyond Danielle's immediate circle. Investigators considered whether she could have encountered someone she did not know well. This included reviewing reports of suspicious behavior in nearby areas and examining whether similar incidents had occurred. No pattern emerged that could be tied directly to her death. The lack of progress placed pressure on the investigation, but also required restraint. Acting on weak leads risks compromising the integrity of a case. Detectives avoided narrowing their focus too quickly, understanding that premature conclusions can cause critical details to be overlooked. Physical evidence remained central. Items collected from the scene were re-examined. Laboratory results were reviewed again. At that time, forensic science could confirm certain facts, but it could not provide identity without a known comparison. The evidence existed, but it did not speak clearly. As weeks passed, the investigation entered a familiar phase for unsolved cases. Information was still being processed, but new material slowed. Detectives revisited earlier assumptions and challenged them. They looked again at what might have been missed, not because of error, but because perspective changes as time passes. Community concern did not fade. Danielle's death remained a subject of conversation and worry. Parents suggested routines. Schools addressed safety. The absence of answers created an environment where fear and uncertainty lingered longer than the initial shock. Law enforcement faced the challenge of maintaining momentum without direction. Resources must be allocated carefully. Investigators continued to work the case, but the absence of new evidence limited what could be done actively. The file remained open, the effort remained real, progress remained elusive. This stage of the investigation revealed the limits of traditional methods when evidence does not point decisively. Interviews can confirm what did not happen, but they cannot always reveal what did. Tips can generate volume, but not clarity. Forensic material can be preserved, but not always interpreted fully at the time. As months went by without arrest, the investigation shifted in posture. The work did not stop, but it changed. Active pursuit gave way to review and preservation. Detectives ensured that all documentation was complete and accurate. Evidence was secured properly. The case was prepared to endure time rather than outrun it. For Danielle Houchins, this period marked the transition from urgency to endurance. The investigation had not failed. It had reached the edge of what was possible with the information available. The questions remained. The answers did not. What followed would not be driven by immediate discovery, but by patience. The case moved forward not through resolution, but through careful holding. Every detail that could be preserved was preserved. Every lead that could be examined was examined. The absence of resolution did not diminish the seriousness of the crime. It underscored its complexity. Danielle's death remained unexplained, but not ignored. The investigation continued in a quieter form, shaped by limits rather than conclusions, waiting for a moment when progress could return. As time passed, the investigation settled into a quieter rhythm. The urgency that followed Danielle Houchins's death gave way to careful maintenance. Detectives continued to review what had been collected, but without new information, progress remained limited. The case did not end. It changed shape. Files were organized and preserved. Reports were checked for completeness. Evidence was secured to ensure it could withstand time. These steps may appear procedural, but they carry long-term weight. In cases without immediate resolution, preservation becomes the investigation's backbone. Investigators revisited the record periodically. Each review asked the same questions: what was known, what had been ruled out, what remained uncertain. Without new leads, those reviews rarely altered conclusions. Still, they mattered. They kept the case active within the system. The limitations of the era continued to define what could be done. DNA evidence existed, but comparison options were minimal. Without a suspect to test against, results remained inconclusive. The science could confirm the presence of biological material, but not identity. That gap shaped expectations and decisions. Over time, attention from the public diminished. New cases emerged. Daily life moved on. Within law enforcement, priorities shifted as resources were directed toward investigations with immediate opportunity for resolution. Danielle's case remained open, but it no longer occupied daily focus. For her family, the passage of time brought no relief. The absence of answers remained unchanged. Each year added distance from the moment she was lost, but not from the questions that followed. Hope did not disappear, it adapted. It learned to exist alongside uncertainty. Within the community, the case became part of shared memory. It was referenced quietly, often when discussions turned to safety or loss. The lack of resolution gave it a different presence than cases with clear outcomes. It lingered rather than concluded. Cold cases often exist in this state for long periods. They are neither active nor forgotten. They wait. The waiting is not passive. It depends on the integrity of records and the care taken to preserve evidence. Any failure during this phase can erase the possibility of future progress. Law enforcement acknowledged these realities. The case was classified as unsolved but not closed. That distinction matters. It means that responsibility remains assigned to the system. It means the door stays open for new information. During these years, no suspect was publicly identified. No arrest was made. The absence of action was not the result of indifference. It reflected the boundaries imposed by proof and procedure. Acting without evidence risks error. In cases involving a minor victim, that risk carries additional weight. The quiet persistence of the case depended on people who ensured it was not lost to time. Evidence custodians maintained proper storage. Records officers preserved documentation. Detectives passed knowledge forward as personnel changed. Continuity became the most valuable asset. As technology advanced elsewhere, the case remained unchanged. Developments in forensic science were noted, but without the ability to apply them meaningfully, they remained abstract. The evidence waited for a moment when tools and circumstance might align. This period did not produce answers, it produced endurance. The case survived because it was held carefully rather than hurried. That survival would later matter. For Danielle Houchins, the cold case years represented a long pause, not an ending, not a solution, a suspension shaped by limits and patience. The investigation remained present within the system, preserved in anticipation of a future that could not yet be defined. The weight of unresolved loss did not diminish with time, it settled into permanence. And beneath that stillness, the case waited, intact and unfinished, for a reason to move again. As the investigation slowed, responsibility shifted from pursuit to protection. What mattered most now was not speed, but care. The evidence collected in 1996 became the case itself. How it was stored, cataloged, and maintained would determine whether the investigation had any future at all. Biological material recovered during the original inquiry was preserved according to forensic standards of the time. Each item was logged, sealed, and placed into controlled storage. These procedures may appear routine, but they are critical. In cases without suspects, evidence must survive years without degradation, contamination, or loss. At the time, there was no way to know whether future technology would offer new answers. Investigators preserved material not because they expected quick progress, but because preservation was the only responsible option. Once evidence is lost or compromised, it cannot be replaced. Over the years, custody of the evidence passed through different hands. Law enforcement personnel changed. Administrations shifted. Facilities were updated. Throughout these transitions, maintaining the integrity of the material required consistency and documentation. Chain of custody records ensured that every transfer was recorded and traceable. This process often receives little attention, yet it is one of the most fragile points in long-term investigations. Evidence must remain intact not only physically but legally. Any break in documentation can undermine future use. In Danielle Houchins' case, careful handling ensured that possibility remained open. As forensic science advanced, awareness grew that older cases might benefit from new testing methods. DNA analysis became faster, more precise, and supported by expanding databases. However, access to these tools did not immediately translate into action. Retesting requires funding, prioritization, and legal review. For many years, Danielle's case remained unsuited for additional testing. Without a suspect or comparison profile, DNA results would still lack context. Law enforcement monitored developments while ensuring the evidence remained viable. During this period, the case was reviewed periodically to assess whether new technology could be applied meaningfully. These reviews were cautious. Testing evidence prematurely can consume material that cannot be replaced. Investigators weighed potential benefit against irreversible cost. Preservation extended beyond physical material. Case files, reports, photographs, and laboratory results were maintained carefully. These records provided the framework necessary to interpret evidence if testing became possible later. Without documentation, results lose meaning. The importance of this quiet work cannot be overstated. Many cold cases failed not because evidence never existed, but because it was not preserved properly. Time erodes paper, memory, and material. Only deliberate care prevents that erosion from becoming fatal to an investigation. For Danielle's family, this stage offered little visible progress. Years passed without announcements or developments. Yet behind the scenes, the case remained alive in a technical sense. The groundwork for future action was being protected, even if results were not yet possible. Within law enforcement, the case served as an example of restraint. Acting without sufficient capability can do harm. Waiting, while difficult, can preserve opportunity. The decision to hold evidence rather than exhaust it reflected an understanding of long-term responsibility. As decades passed, advancements in forensic databases began changing what was possible. DNA profiles could now be compared against far broader collections. The idea that evidence from the 1990s could identify a suspect no longer seemed abstract. Still, no action was taken until conditions aligned. Preservation continued. Documentation was reviewed. The case remained intact rather than consumed by time. This stage of the investigation was defined by patience rather than pursuit. It lacked urgency but required discipline. The absence of movement did not signal neglect, it reflected preparation. For Danielle Houchins, the years of preservation represented an unseen form of effort. While answers remained distant, the possibility of accountability was being protected quietly and deliberately. When the moment finally came to apply new tools, it would only be possible because the evidence had survived intact. The long years of waiting had not been empty. They had been spent holding the case together, piece by piece, against the steady pressure of time. As the years passed, forensic science changed in ways that early investigators could not have anticipated. DNA analysis evolved from a limited laboratory tool into a central pillar of modern investigations. What once required large samples and narrow comparisons became faster, more precise, and supported by expanding databases. In the late 1990s, DNA testing could confirm the presence of biological material, but it rarely identified a person unless investigators already had someone to compare it against. Databases were small and incomplete. Many individuals had never provided DNA samples, and national systems were still developing. Evidence could exist without a name to attach to it. Over time, that landscape shifted. Advances in testing methods allowed analysts to generate usable profiles from smaller and older samples. Preservation that once merely prevented loss now created opportunity. Evidence that had been carefully stored could be examined in ways that were not previously possible. Law enforcement agencies began revisiting unsolved cases across the country. Cold cases involving preserved biological evidence were reviewed to determine whether new testing might produce results. This process required careful evaluation. Testing is not reversible. Once evidence is consumed, it cannot be tested again. Each decision carried weight. In Danielle Houchins' case, investigators assessed whether conditions had finally aligned. The preserved evidence remained intact. Documentation was complete. Advances in DNA databases meant that a profile could now be compared against a far wider population than ever before. When testing was approved, it was conducted with precision. Modern laboratory procedures emphasized contamination prevention and accuracy. Analysts worked to extract a usable DNA profile from material collected decades earlier. The success of this step depended entirely on the preservation efforts made years before. Once a profile was generated, it was entered into national DNA databases. These systems compare profiles against known offenders and other stored samples, searching for matches. This process operates silently, without assumption or theory. It relies on mathematics rather than memory. For years, no match had been possible. Now, comparison became feasible. The system searched for consistency across thousands of profiles, narrowing possibilities through probability rather than suspicion. This stage marked a quiet turning point. There was no public announcement, no immediate result. DNA analysis often requires patience. Profiles are compared repeatedly as databases expand and update. A match may appear months or years after initial submission. In this case, persistence mattered. As databases grew, the likelihood of identifying a match increased. Eventually, a connection emerged. The DNA profile associated with Danielle Houchins' case matched that of a man named Paul Hutchinson. This identification did not stand alone. Investigators confirmed the match through established verification procedures. Multiple checks ensured accuracy. DNA matches require confirmation to rule out error. Only after validation did law enforcement consider the identification reliable. The emergence of a name did not conclude the process. It began a new phase of responsibility. Investigators reviewed Hutchinson's background, history, and any potential connection to Danielle or the area. This review was conducted carefully, without public speculation. Importantly, the DNA result did not reinterpret the past. It did not explain motive or circumstance. It provided a factual link between preserved evidence and a specific individual. That link changed what was possible. For the first time since 1996, the case had moved beyond uncertainty anchored solely in absence. The evidence that had waited silently now carried identifying power. What had once been potential became actionable. This stage demonstrated the value of patience and restraint. The decision to preserve evidence rather than exhaust it allowed modern tools to be applied decades later. Advances in science did not correct the past, they built upon it. For Danielle's family, this development represented movement after years of stillness. Answers remained incomplete, but the case was no longer without direction. The long wait had not erased the possibility of accountability. From an investigative perspective, this moment reinforced a broader lesson. Technology alone does not solve cases. Preservation, documentation, and timing determine whether technology can be used at all. The identification of a DNA match marked the point where the case could move forward with clarity grounded in science rather than inference. After decades defined by limits, the investigation entered a stage shaped by verification and fact. What followed would depend not on new theory, but on how this evidence was handled within legal boundaries. The long arc of the case had finally reached a place where progress was possible, because the groundwork laid years earlier had held firm against time. The identification of a DNA match transformed the investigation from technical possibility into active responsibility. After decades of uncertainty, law enforcement now faced a task defined not by absence, but by verification. A name existed. What followed required precision rather than momentum. Paul Hutchinson had been identified through forensic comparison, linking his DNA to biological evidence preserved from Danielle Houchins' case. This result was not treated as a conclusion on its own. Investigators understood that a match carries weight only when it is confirmed, contextualized, and handled within legal standards. The first step was validation. Analysts confirmed the accuracy of the DNA match through established procedures designed to eliminate error. Multiple checks ensured that the profile was correct and that the comparison met scientific thresholds. Only after this process did investigators move forward. Once confirmation was secured, attention shifted to background review. Investigators examined Hutchinson's history, residence, and known movements. This review focused on documented facts rather than assumption. The goal was not to reconstruct motive, but to understand whether the identification aligned with what was known from the original investigation. Law enforcement worked carefully to avoid public speculation. The case had waited decades. Moving too quickly now risked compromising its integrity. Investigators gathered information quietly, maintaining confidentiality while assessing next steps. This phase reflected a change in posture rather than tone. The investigation was no longer searching broadly, it was narrowing with intent. Evidence that had once lacked context now guided action. Authorities coordinated internally to determine how to proceed. The presence of a DNA match does not automatically result in charges. Legal responsibility requires more than identification. Investigators had to consider how the evidence would be presented, what additional corroboration might exist, and how to act within due process. Hutchinson was located and approached by law enforcement. This contact followed procedural standards. Investigators sought to address the identification directly while maintaining the boundaries required by law. The process emphasized documentation and restraint. The emergence of a suspect after so many years carried emotional weight, but investigators avoided framing the moment as resolution. The case had not yet reached a legal conclusion. The system does not operate on implication, it operates on evidence and process. For Danielle's family, the identification represented a shift they had waited years to see. The case was no longer defined solely by unanswered questions. A factual link had been established. Even so, clarity remained incomplete. The name provided direction, not closure. Within the broader community, the development drew attention. News of the DNA match spread, marking the first significant advancement in the case in decades. Public reaction was measured, shaped by awareness that identification alone does not equate to legal outcome. From an investigative standpoint, this stage demonstrated the careful balance required when science intersects with law. DNA can identify, it cannot explain. It does not replace the need for lawful procedure. Investigators remained focused on what the evidence could support, not what it suggested emotionally. The case moved forward deliberately. Each step was evaluated for legal soundness. Documentation was updated. Decisions were reviewed. The goal was not speed, but durability. This moment also underscored the value of restraint shown in earlier years. Because evidence had been preserved properly and records maintained accurately, investigators could act with confidence now. The identification did not rely on reinterpretation, it relied on preserved fact. The long delay between crime and identification did not diminish responsibility, it emphasized it. Time had not erased accountability, it had only postponed the moment when it could be addressed. As the investigation progressed beyond identification, law enforcement prepared for outcomes that could not yet be predicted. The presence of a suspect introduced new variables, including legal limitations shaped by time and circumstance. What was clear was that the case had crossed a boundary it had not crossed before. Danielle Houchins' death was no longer without a name connected through evidence. The system had reached a point where action was possible, guided by science, procedure, and careful judgment. This stage marked the transition from waiting to responsibility. The evidence had spoken at last. How that voice would be handled would define what came next. With a verified DNA match established, the investigation moved into a sensitive and carefully controlled phase. Law enforcement now had an obligation to act not only to advance the case, but to do so within strict legal and ethical boundaries. The presence of scientific identification required confirmation through direct procedural steps. Investigators arranged to speak with Paul Hutchinson. This contact was handled according to standard law enforcement practice. The purpose was not to announce conclusions, but to document interaction following the forensic identification. Interviews in such cases are designed to clarify facts, confirm identity, and ensure that all actions are recorded accurately. The interview itself was part of a formal investigative process. Officers documented the interaction and followed established protocols. No public conclusions were announced at that time. The case remained active and ongoing, with legal considerations guiding every decision. Shortly after the interview, Paul Hutchinson died by suicide. This development altered the trajectory of the case immediately and permanently. With his death, the possibility of arrest, trial, or courtroom examination ended. Law enforcement responded by documenting the circumstances thoroughly. Investigators confirmed the cause of death and clarified that no charges had been filed prior to his death. These distinctions were important. The case had reached identification, but not prosecution. The absence of a trial meant responsibility would be established through evidence rather than adjudication. Authorities reviewed the forensic findings again, ensuring that the DNA match met all scientific and procedural standards. Public statements emphasized that the case was considered solved based on evidence, not confession or court outcome. For Danielle Houchins' family, the aftermath brought complex emotions. The identification of a suspect provided long-awaited direction, but the sudden end to legal proceedings left questions unanswered. The justice system could no longer test evidence in court or determine guilt through trial. Within the community, reaction was restrained. The case had returned to public attention after decades of silence, only to conclude without a conventional legal resolution. This outcome reflected the realities of long-delayed investigations rather than failure of process. Law enforcement officials addressed the public carefully. They explained how the case could be considered solved despite the absence of prosecution. The explanation centered on forensic certainty, evidence preservation, and the standards used to determine responsibility outside a courtroom setting. This moment highlighted a limitation inherent in the justice system. Legal accountability depends on the presence of a defendant. When that presence is removed, the system must rely on documentation rather than verdicts. In this case, the evidence provided that foundation. The investigation did not end abruptly. Authorities completed internal reviews, finalized reports, and ensured that all findings were recorded accurately. These steps ensured transparency and preserved the record for historical and institutional purposes. The role of DNA evidence remained central. It served as the primary link between the crime and the identified individual. Without it, the case would have remained unresolved. With it, investigators could state conclusions based on scientific verification rather than assumption. This stage required careful communication. Officials avoided emotional framing and focused on factual explanation. The goal was clarity rather than closure. The outcome was presented as the most complete resolution possible under the circumstances. The immediate aftermath underscored both progress and limitation. The case had advanced farther than it ever had before. At the same time, it ended without the processes typically associated with justice. For Danielle Houchins, the investigation reached its farthest point through evidence rather than courtroom proceedings. The system responded within its limits, guided by proof, procedure, and restraint. This chapter of the case was not defined by triumph or finality. It was defined by responsibility. The evidence spoke clearly, the process followed law, and the outcome reflected a reality shaped by time, science, and circumstance rather than narrative completion. After the immediate aftermath of identification and death of the suspect, the investigation entered its final procedural stage. This phase focused not on pursuit but on classification. Law enforcement had to determine how the case would be concluded within the boundaries of law, evidence, and institutional responsibility. Without the possibility of arrest or trial, the standard path to resolution was unavailable. Courts determined guilt through proceedings that require a living defendant. In this case, that condition no longer existed. The absence of prosecution did not erase the evidence, but it changed how conclusions were reached and recorded. Authorities reviewed the case in full. Investigators revisited the original evidence, the preserved biological material, and the DNA analysis that linked Paul Hutchinson to the crime. Each element was evaluated to ensure that procedures had been followed correctly and that conclusions were supported by verifiable facts rather than assumption. The determination that the case was solved rested primarily on forensic certainty. DNA evidence provided a direct scientific connection between the preserved material and the identified individual. This connection did not depend on testimony, confession, or interpretation. It was grounded in probability, verification, and accepted scientific standards. Authorities explained that while no court judgment could occur, the evidentiary threshold for identifying responsibility had been met. The decision to classify the case as solved reflected confidence in the forensic findings and the integrity of the investigative process that supported them. This distinction is important. Solved does not mean prosecuted. It means that investigators can state, based on evidence, who was responsible. The justice system recognizes this difference, particularly in cases where prosecution becomes impossible due to death. Documentation played a central role in this stage. Reports were finalized, findings were summarized clearly. The case file was updated to reflect its resolved status and the basis for that resolution. These records ensured transparency and accountability, both internally and to the public. Officials emphasized that the conclusion did not rely on speculation or inference. It relied on preserved evidence and scientific analysis. By grounding the resolution in fact, law enforcement sought to provide clarity without overstating certainty beyond what the evidence supported. For Danielle Houchins's family, this classification brought an end to procedural uncertainty. The case was no longer open or unresolved. Responsibility had been identified. At the same time, the absence of judicial process meant that some aspects of accountability remained symbolic rather than adjudicated. Within the broader legal system, the case illustrated how long-delayed investigations can still reach resolution without trial. Cold cases do not always end in courtrooms. Sometimes they end through confirmation rather than conviction. This outcome also highlighted the role of evidence preservation in enabling such resolutions. Without intact biological material and careful documentation, the case would have remained unanswered. The legal conclusion depended not only on modern technology, but on decisions made decades earlier to protect the integrity of evidence. Authorities avoided celebratory language when announcing the resolution. The tone remained factual and restrained. The conclusion was presented as the most accurate and responsible outcome possible under the circumstances. The classification of the case did not attempt to rewrite history. It acknowledged the limits imposed by time and loss. It recognized that justice, in this instance, could not take its usual form. What it provided instead was record-based accountability. The system documented responsibility clearly and transparently. It closed the case not by verdict, but by evidence. This phase marked the end of the investigative journey. The disappearance and death of Danielle Houchins were no longer defined by uncertainty alone. They were defined by a documented conclusion grounded in science and procedure. The legal closure of the case did not offer completeness. It offered clarity. It did not answer every question. It answered the one that had remained unresolved for decades. With that determination recorded, the case moved from active record to historical record. The investigation ended not with finality, but with responsibility established to the fullest extent the law could allow. When the case was formally resolved, The effect extended beyond official records. For Belgrade and the surrounding area, Danielle Houchins' death had remained part of collective memory for nearly 3 decades. The conclusion did not reopen old wounds so much as acknowledge that they had never fully closed. Residents who remembered the events of 1996 reflected on how the case had shaped local awareness. The loss of a teenager in a small community altered how people thought about safety, trust, and routine. Even as years passed, the absence of resolution kept those concerns present in subtle ways. The announcement that the case was solved through DNA evidence brought a different kind of response. There was no sense of surprise, but there was recognition. The outcome confirmed that the case had not been forgotten or abandoned. It affirmed that effort had continued, even when progress was not visible. For Danielle's family, the conclusion marked a boundary. The long period of not knowing had ended. Responsibility had been identified. At the same time, the lack of a trial meant that the process did not include public examination or judgment. The outcome provided clarity rather than confrontation. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case addressed the community with care. Officials emphasized evidence preservation, procedural discipline, and the importance of restraint. They did not frame the resolution as a success story. They framed it as the result of long-term commitment and careful handling of information. Institutionally, the case prompted reflection on investigative practice. The importance of maintaining evidence, documentation, and continuity over decades was clear. Decisions made early in the investigation enabled later resolution. Errors avoided were as significant as actions taken. The case also highlighted the role of evolving technology. Advances in DNA analysis corrected a limitation rather than a mistake. The investigation had not failed in 1996. It had reached the limits of what was possible at the time. That distinction mattered for understanding how accountability eventually emerged. Within the broader context of cold cases, Danielle Houchins' case became an example of how resolution can occur without prosecution. It demonstrated that legal accountability does not always follow a traditional path. Evidence can establish responsibility even when courts cannot render verdicts. Community response reflected this understanding. There was acknowledgement of progress without expectation of emotional closure. The outcome did not change the past, it clarified it. Media coverage during this period remained factual. Reporting focused on process, evidence, and explanation rather than narrative or spectacle. This approach reinforced public trust and aligned with the seriousness of the case. For institutions, the case reinforced the value of patience. Investigative systems are often judged by speed. This outcome showed the importance of endurance. Time did not diminish responsibility. It delayed recognition until conditions allowed for accuracy. The resolution also prompted renewed attention to other unsolved cases. It served as a reminder that preserved evidence and careful records can still matter decades later. Awareness grew around the importance of reporting information, even when time has passed. This stage of the case did not redefine justice. It clarified its limits. The system responded within those limits, guided by proof rather than pressure. For the community, the conclusion allowed the case to be placed into context. Danielle Houchins' uncertainty with record-based accountability. And it demonstrated that persistence, when paired with restraint and evidence, can still correct the record long after time has moved on. The resolution of Danielle Houchins' case offers lessons grounded in process rather than emotion. It shows how justice can depend less on urgency and more on preservation. From the earliest days, decisions about evidence handling shaped what would be possible decades later. Those choices mattered long after active investigation slowed. One lesson lies in the limits of early certainty. In 1996, investigators worked within the tools available. They collected evidence, documented the scene, and followed procedure. When progress stalled, the absence of answers was not the result of neglect. It reflected technological boundaries that could not be crossed at the time. Understanding those limits is essential when judging past investigations. Another lesson centers on evidence preservation. Biological material was protected carefully, and records were maintained accurately. This discipline allowed modern DNA testing to be applied years later. Without that care, identification would not have been possible. Preservation turned patience into opportunity. The case also illustrates how time reshapes investigations. As years pass, witnesses become harder to locate, memories lose precision, and legal options narrow. At the same time, technology advances. Progress depends on whether systems are prepared to bridge that gap. In this case, preparation made the difference. There is also a lesson about accountability without prosecution. Courts determine guilt through trials, but trials require living defendants. When that path closes, responsibility can still be established through evidence. This outcome demonstrates how the justice system adapts when conventional resolution is unavailable. It relies on documentation, verification, and transparency. The role of DNA in this case should be understood clearly. DNA did not solve the case on its own. It worked because evidence had been preserved and because procedures were followed carefully when testing occurred. Science supported the investigation. It did not replace it. For families of victims, the case highlights a difficult truth. Legal resolution does not always bring complete understanding. It can provide clarity without explanation. It can identify responsibility without offering confrontation. Recognizing that distinction helps set realistic expectations about what the system can deliver. From an institutional perspective, the case reinforces the value of restraint. Acting prematurely can compromise future outcomes. Waiting, while difficult, can preserve the chance for accuracy. The balance between action and patience defined this investigation from start to finish. The case also serves as a reminder that unresolved investigations do not disappear. They remain within the system, dependent on record-keeping and continuity. When conditions change, those records can regain relevance. Time does not erase responsibility. It delays recognition until proof becomes possible. Community impact offers another lesson. Quiet persistence often matters more than public pressure. The case returned to attention not because of spectacle, but because evidence supported movement. That approach preserved trust and ensured that conclusions were grounded in fact. Ultimately, this case teaches that justice is not always complete, but it can still be responsible. It operates within limits, shaped by law, evidence, and circumstance. When those elements align, even after decades, accountability can be established. The story of Danielle Houchins is not defined by how long it took to reach resolution, but by how carefully the path was preserved. It stands as an example of how evidence, patience, and procedure can correct the record, even when time has passed and certainty once seemed unreachable.